optimism that sees us going more towards contender, but it could just as well completely collapse in 2017. I mean, we could find on paper 6 free agents who look like they're just going to fit perfect, and then, God forbid, they all get injured in minicamp and training camp. And then, we draft 6 guys in the draft, and half of them don't pan out. I mean, anything can happen, so you never really know. But it's like we've talked about so many times. The talent that we have, there is a foundation. There just isn't an entire house. I mean, the team has got enough to really have a platform to build on. We're just missing so many pieces, and a lot of that has to do with things like you're saying, positional coaching, which is something I've talked about, you've talked about, and even now getting to the point where Coach Payton had to bring in a second opinion, basically. Now the bigger national media is beginning to talk about the positional woes that we've really had, and we've had it at several positions, and special teams simply the highlight of that. There are some guys that are kind of, it's debatable. An example being Bill Johnson. Some people believe he's doing good enough for what he's given. Some people don't believe that. I'm kind of in the middle. It's a gray area. Everybody knows I'm not a big fan of Joe Vitt in terms of a positional coach. I think in terms of, an assistant coach type role, he's somebody that you want on your staff. And I think he has value there. A lot of Saints fans are probably going to fight me on that. But I think that's more directed because they don't believe that he can really cultivate a linebacker talent at that positional coach position that he's at. And I don't argue that. But I do think in terms of as a coach, as an assistant coach, the knowledge that he brings to the game, the relationships, things like that, he has value. But, there's an issue that arises when you consistently don't see production and growth from your positional coaches in terms of the players that they're raising that you give them to bring about. Defensive line, I'm pretty happy with. Offensively, I really think Payton is a stud when it comes to finding offensive talent, whether it's through the draft or UDFAs. And there's very few people that I would rank as high as Payton when it comes to offensive talent. I really have no complaints there. Every time I complain about the offense, it is more centered around the play calling. But defense is still the key there, and I know I'm starting to ramble. I'll let you get some words in, I promise. But you can't run any defense if you don't have enough players to get on the field. And as much as I love guys like Ellerbe and Bro, and I've loved watching P.J. Williams film, guys like that, if you're not able to play at least 12 games a year, let alone 16, I realize in today's NFL it's a rough sport. It's a hard-hitting sport. Guys are bigger. They're faster. They hit harder. Yet your organs and your bones do not just develop another layer to protect you. So, injuries seem to be becoming more common in terms of the little nagging ones, not necessarily the bigger ones like ACL tears and ligament tears, but, stuff like Ingram's turf toe or, somebody sprains a wrist or hand, or you've got knee issues with Armstead. That seems to be becoming more common for, at least in my opinion, because everybody's getting so bigger and stronger. But if you can play at least 12, 13 games in a season, and I put that stat out on Twitter, the Saints had one of the lowest numbers of players who played at least 12 or 13 games compared to like the Patriots, who were a playoff team. And some of that's youth. Other things are conditioning and strength coach, and that's one of the positions that we're talking about, positional coachings that need an upgrade. So I'm going to cut that right there to let you get a word in because I know I just went over a lot of stuff. But just kind of to reiterate the point that we're talking about, there is a deficiency from the coaching position that is not allowed, and from the depth position of our actual players that has not allowed us to advance to that contender role, and that's why we're teetering on that pretender role.
Well, I'll say this. I totally agree with everything you just laid out as far as being on the fence about Bill Johnson, the propensity to say it's great to keep Joe Vitt around in some capacity, but maybe not what he is. I'll say this. The thing that bothers me about the Joe Vitt situation is exactly what you said. I don't believe Joe Vitt can mold young talent into becoming elite talent. However, I have to think a guy like Sean Payton, who's a very smart coach. We get, as you said, we like to give him, hell on earth, if you will, because of the play calling. But we can't challenge his acumen as an offensive mind, and even as a head coach in some area, when it comes to certain things. Loyalty gets in the way, yes. And maybe that to a fault, that has been to the detriment of the team as a whole. But I have to say this. Strengths and weaknesses. If you understand at this point, or maybe he doesn't understand, I could be misreading this one. If you understand that in your tenure of being a head coach, Joe Vitt has yet to take a young, talented linebacker and make him an elite linebacker. Mm-hmm. Don't go get a young linebacker. Now, I know I'm going to contradict myself later on in the show when we bring Barry on. But my point is that he has yet to prove he can do it. Stephon Anthony last year made plays based on his athletic talent alone. What Dennis Allen noticed, and then nobody else seemed to be able to catch on to, is that that's all he was using. It was pure physical ability. He didn't have the ability to dissect an offense and say, this is why I'm at the point where I'm at. But he just knew to get there. It was almost like he was going off of instincts alone. He didn't understand what he was doing. He just ended up in the right place. But if you understand Joe Vitt doesn't have the ability to coach that type of player, don't draft a linebacker. Go get a veteran linebacker that's not a James Laurinaitis, who you and I were both against him bringing in, by the way. Mm-hmm. But if you can't draft a linebacker and mold them into an elite guy, go get a linebacker that you don't need to that much coaching up to do. Ellaby and Craig Robertson are great examples of that. You didn't have to draft those guys. You were able to sign them in free agency. And before I get on my rant about what's going on, let me say this now that I've kind of, spoken on free agency. You and I have both discussed free agency in the terms of what the Saints will do to go out and spend money. I'm starting to get a small inkling that maybe, just maybe, it won't be about the Saints necessarily spending money, but maybe acquiring money that's already out there. A lot of Saints fans went kind of berserk when, the news of Joe Hayden, that the Saints were trying to pursue him. Maybe it's going to be a situation to where the Saints don't necessarily spend on free agency, but they make a trade to bring in salary versus just flat out spending on a guy. So I'm not sure, but I'm starting to get a weird feeling that maybe that's the strategy going into this offseason. I would hope that it's built through the draft, but as we've seen with the Saints, they are so unpredictable. They do things in which sometimes confuses the heck out of you. One system says, let's go with the best player available in the draft and let's fill our needs during free agency. And another year, be like, you know what? I don't even need that guy. Let's just acquire as much talent as we can, and we'll figure it all out from the rest of it. I don't know. They're so unpredictable. I don't know which way they can go, but maybe you can have a crack at some of the ideas that for scenarios that I'm throwing out.
I mean, it's possible. I want to say no simply because I don't want that to happen really bad. But, I mean, the Saints certainly have traded for players before, especially during the draft. If you go back to earlier 06 to 09, 10, 11, when Payton was kind of in the build the team mode, he traded for several players. And it's certainly possible. I don't want the Hayden one that you brought up. I thought Bleacher Report released a very good article about how basically, and they didn't say it like this, they didn't dog the guy, but basically saying that he's living off name only right now. Now, not everybody is a huge analytics, lover. I mean, I have several friends who either blog or actually on the media level who don't like Pro Football Focus. However, there is something to be said when you take that, and as long as you're using it as a constant, so you're not like pulling Pro Football Focus and comparing it to sporting charts, you can use it to compare against itself. And in their system, Hayden has not been effective for right around 4 years, and it's been a decline since he made his name. Back in 2011 was a real good year for him. I think he was like the 4th rated corner in the NFL. I have to go back and look.
2012 was his last good year, if I'm not mistaken.
So somewhere around there, though, 09 to 11, he was one of the highest rated Pro Football Focus corners in the NFL consistently for 2 or 3 years. And since then, he has tapered off to the point that he has basically collapsed in numbers to where he's barely in the top 100. And I know that sounds drastic, but they are taking that, starting corners, nickel corners, everybody in coverage, and he has really fell down. What was his rank when you posted that article, like 64th or something? Which
like
is just
64th or something. It was definitely in the mid to upper 60s, and going towards the 70 mark. And another thing is that people want to say, well, he was injured. No, his decline started long before his injury started.
Yeah, and it's one of those. Sure, a guy can come out of that and suddenly be good again, but remember, most skill position players have a max elite level of 4 years. Darrelle Revis is a good example. Darrelle Revis is not bad now, but he was elite, best corner in the NFL for about 4 years. And now I give that title to Chris Harris Jr., and he probably will hold it for another 2 years before somebody tops him. And because age just plays such a huge factor. I mean, it doesn't seem like much, but I can tell you that I'm not the same now at 27 that I was at 21. So a little time like that in the NFL makes a huge change. There are some players who can overcome that. An example of that would be like a Terrell Owens or a Randy Moss, who are able to play the skill position and still excel later in life. And heck, Adrian Peterson, even with his injuries, has still done much better and longer than your average NFL back. So some of them can do it, but overall, guys like Hayden and even guys like Keenan Lewis are eventually going to start tapering off and not be as strong as they once were. The most famous one to me in recent memories is when the Philadelphia Eagles created their quote-unquote dream team and brought in like Nnamdi Asomugha, and they had this great secondary plan, and it all just fell apart like sand in their hands. You can't build necessarily off 4 or 5 elite years for a skill position player, because they're just not going to be able to produce that consistently like Drew Brees is. 9 straight seasons with 30 or more touchdown passes, NFL record, twice as long as anybody else in history. You're not going to find a corner who – I don't think you could probably ever find a corner who did that unless you go way back to the pre-free agency era and like the 50s and 60s and stuff, to where one corner was the best for, half a decade or a decade. I can't even think of a single name of a player who would even qualify for that.
I totally agree, and that's why I don't think big money should be thrown at free agent corners unless you get a guy who's starting to reach his peak that hasn't made it there just yet. I think that would be the better way to go, personally. That's just an opinion of mine, but I think the Saints will need to address the cornerback position, and I definitely think it's long overdue for them to upgrade themselves at the linebacker spot as well. But you thought they did that with Stephon Anthony, and it kind of has me a little bit puzzled, because I know Stephon Anthony is more of a Rob Ryan type of linebacker. But long before you drafted Anthony, you also knew that you were bringing in Dennis Allen. So it throws me for a bit. I'm not really sure what the plan is going to be with Anthony moving forward. He was just placed on IR, which I find to be a joke that you would place him on IR, considering that he hasn't really played all season. But,
yeah, I
mean, it has me wondering what's the plan going in, because you and I can sit down and knock out the Saints positions of need, for days. We could do it, come up with a draft order and all the other stuff, but I mean, the reality is that the Saints have to address it. It can't be anything you or I do or any of the fans do. We can all see what they need. It's a matter of what the Saints actually address it. And cornerback is a heck of a lot bigger need than anybody wants to address. Yes, we all love Delvin Breaux and his potential, but he hasn't really reached his potential because he hasn't really played to do so. I've been one of the people on my soapbox about the fact that everybody likes to talk about the offensive players that the Saints lost and how much they miss a Darren Sproles, Reggie Bush, Jimmy Graham, so on and so forth. The Saints missed Jabari Greer. That's who the Saints missed, because that defense hasn't been the same since Jabari Greer went down in Carolina. Has not been the same, and they have yet to replace Jabari Greer. And everybody thought Delvin Breaux would be that next guy. A little bit of a problem with that. Greatest ability in the NFL, availability. Delvin ain't around much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and as much as, because even those who aren't a huge fan of Breaux on film, believe it or not, there's plenty of Saints fans who aren't. Even if you love him or hate him, there's one thing about Breaux that is a sad truth. His story is great, but because of his story, the circumstances he's had to go through, he's coming to the NFL much older than normal. And the NFL is not this magic marker where until, once you start, you have a certain amount of time that you're allowed to be great. You can't just walk into the NFL at 30 years old, and because the average corner lasts, say, 6 years, then he makes it to 36. No, there is a limited window, usually between the 24 and 29-year-old mark for a corner where most of them mature and are good or great. That just seems to be the age range for that position. And if I'm not mistaken, Delvin Breaux's 28 right now. And it's not like he did